Life of Letitia Chapter 16-19. Form 1H was beginning to show its colors. There began to be little clashes with teachers, and some students were already trying out the school rules that in our first week we had pledged to obey. Now, everybody knew, but nobody would breathe a word, that Doreen Sandiford and her gang had been to the plaza at least twice, to buy chicken and chips. The La Puerta shopping plaza was most strictly out of bounds, and to break this rule was a very serious offense, for which students would be suspended. We were banned from the plaza, Miss Hafiz had explained, because there had been cases of students shoplifting, and because there were drug pushers in the plaza whose specialty was schoolchildren. Nobody dared to tell on Doreen Sandiford and her gang. We wouldn't dream of it. Doreen Sandiford was a tall, strapping girl with a hoarse voice who looked as though she could mash a man into the ground. Even Marlon Peters had respect for Doreen Sandiford. He was the ringleader of a gang of boys who had taken on the job of keeping things lively in class. Marlon Peters's gang fell off their chairs on cue, they dropped the pans that contained their maths instruments onto the floor, they farted. But it all depended on who the teacher was. They tried none of that on Miss Hafiz nor on Mr. Joseph. In literature class Mr. Joseph was reading a book to us, a chapter at a time. It was called The Year in San Fernando, and it was the only thing that could make Marlon Peters and his gang pay attention. In fact, whenever it was time for the year in San Fernando, Marlon Peters and Naushad Ali would pick up their chairs and move to the front of the class. There they sat, as still as statues, listening. If anyone made the slightest noise, the two of them would turn and glare at that person. But nobody would willfully disturb Mr. Joseph when he was reading this story. The whole class was captivated. It was a story about us, and our world. We were surprised, and thrilled, that the ordinary, everyday things we took part in could find their way into a story. It meant that we were real, and had weight, like the people in stories, as important as we felt in Mr. Joseph's class, though, Mrs. Lopez was always there to turn us into nothing. She would float into the classroom on a cloud of elegant perfume, teach her maths scornfully, and depart again with her head still in the air. Whether or not we understood anything was no concern of hers. We didn't often ask questions, either, nobody wanted to disturb her. We were not good enough. One day Anjani put God out of her thoughts and asked Mrs. Lopez to explain something. The circus horse pretended first of all that she could not find the owner of the voice. She stopped in her tracks, narrowed her eyes, and searched all over the classroom. Anjani put up her hand again. Yes, said the circus horse in an icy voice. Anjani asked the question once more, trembling now. Try paying attention in class. Mrs. Lopez snapped, and in the same voice threw her a rapid answer to the question. It was more of a scolding than an explanation. Don't bother with she, I said to Anjani. I will show you. The circus horse finished off her lesson and then gave us exercises to work on. She sat marking papers. I drew closer to Anjani and began to explain to her what she did not understand. The voice of the circus horse cut in. You two veer there. Stop talking in my class. I explaining the maths to Anjani, I said, and not in my most respectful voice. You, explaining the maths to Anjani. You are the teacher now. You taking over my job. The class sat up. The usual low rumble was starting to form. We had never gone further than that with Mrs. Lopez. Everybody would murmur and protest under their breath, but nobody would actually say anything for her to hear. Well, she asked you to explain it and she still don't understand, I said in an accusing voice. A new buzz of excitement rose from the class. By now Doreen Sandiford had begun to suck her teeth loudly behind her hand, and others were chattering heatedly but still under their breath. Nobody wanted to be singled out, for this woman made people feel like cockroaches. Circus horse looked thunderstruck for a moment, and then took charge once more. Madam, don't bring your rudeness here for me, you hear? Leave that at home. I didn't say anything rude. There was war in my voice, and I was looking straight into her face in the way I knew a child should not look at an adult. Yet for some reason she did not march me off to the principal's office. Instead, she drew herself up to her full height and began to give a lecture to the whole class. She seemed grateful for the opportunity. You can take people out of the gutter, she informed us, but you can't take the gutter out of people. You can take a pig out of a pigsty, but you can't take the pigsty out of the pig. Some of us insisted on showing up by our behavior the kind of hole we came out of. She had to say hole and not home because people who came out of proper homes knew how to behave. The government was wasting taxpayers' money sending us to secondary school, because we were not going to turn out any different from our parents. Here she gave a HMPH. Parents. Some of you don't even have parents, mother here, father there, and the government sending you to secondary school, if you please, to give decent people a hard time, casting pearls before swine. I could have told her that I, for one, was glad that my father was nowhere near my mother, but she wouldn't have heard. She had so much to say that it was only the bell that stopped her. The circus horse gathered up her books and papers and stalked out, leaving us in a tense silence. Into this silence full of danger walked poor Mr. Twerry. Chapter 17. For the first few moments we completely ignored him. The class sat quietly boiling with vexation at the circus horse and at ourselves. Then we flew into a rage and all started talking at the same time. Mr. Twerry stood nervously by as our noise grew louder and hands waved angrily in the air. We would do for that bitch. We would do for her. We would put a thumbtack on her chair, push her down the stairs, scrape her car, go to the principal, write to the government, complain to our parents. Mr. Twerry began to make a feeble protest. Nobody paid him any mind. But he was getting angrier and angrier, until all meekness left him and he shocked us by suddenly slamming his book onto the table. The class fell silent. It was our turn to be nervous. What the hell is going on here? This is a fish market or what? You can't behave yourselves, you damn jokers, you can't behave. Take out your Spanish books. The class stayed quiet, and in the few minutes of peace we learned to say, "Mother is making an omelette." Then you began to hear little muffled sounds of commotion coming from different parts of the classroom. A noise was building up again. Suddenly a girl ran screaming from her seat and took refuge behind Mr. Twerry. He was very startled. "What is this? What the hell is going on here? What happened to you, child? Who trouble you?" It was foolish Joanne Carr, prim and proper and afraid of her own shadow. Teasing her was one of the favorite occupations of the boys in the class. "Sir, they put something on me, sir," she wailed. Mr. Twerry turned automatically towards Marlon Peters. At that moment a member of Marlon Peters's gang sitting near me slipped a matchbox onto my desk and sat back straining to look innocent. I peered into the box. There lay nothing but a dead cockroach. The class was in uproar again. Mr. Twerry was shouting at Marlon Peters and everyone was holding a loud, excited discussion with a neighbor. I took up the cockroach by its feelers and walked to the teacher's table, to present it to Mr. Twerry. But he was too busy with Marlon Peters and did not see me. I put the cockroach on the table. When Joanne Carr caught sight of it, she started screaming again. Then Mr. Twerry turned and saw the cockroach, too, and nearly jumped out of his skin. Choking with anger, Mr. Twerry sent out Marlon Peters, Wayne Joseph, and Anderson Lewis. Marlon Peters protested. "Sir, what about Prasad and Ali, sir? Them was in it, too." A chorus of voices agreed. It seemed to us that Mr. Twerry was always letting off the Indian boys in the gang, and blaming Peters and the rest for everything. "Get out of here! Get out of here before I go for the principal!" Mr. Twerry roared. Lewis and Joseph grabbed each other and rushed out of the door with wide-open eyes and funny, jerky movements, like cartoon characters. Marlon Peters sauntered out, singing under his breath, "Coolie, coolie come for Rhodey, all the Rhodey done." Mr. Twerry, in shock, summoned him back. "Yes, sir. Me, sir." Marlon Peters stuck his head through the door, with a stupid grin spread across his face. "What is that? What kind of thing is that I hear you singing? Right in front of me?" Mr. Twerry was going to burst. "Damn jokers. That is what you fellas are. A damn set of jokers, man. Damn baboons. Damn good-for-nothing baboons." Marlon Peters came back into the classroom, still grinning. "Sir, that is a song I hear the other day, sir. You want me to sing it for you, sir?" And he sang the other verse. "Nigger is a nation, damn botheration, GI, them a kick and send them in the station." And he did an Indian dance all the way to the door, rocking his head on his neck and twirling his hands in front of him. Children shrieked, booed, laughed, sang along with him, beat their rulers on their geometry pans, danced in the aisles. And really, we had nothing much against poor Mr. Twerry. Chapter 18. Michael was a new little boy. He was folding his cover neatly every day, and putting his toys away, and even bathing without being asked. I continued to read to him, sometimes a whole story, sometimes part of a story. I often stopped at the most exciting point and left him battling to find out the rest for himself. Sometimes he finished the story by asking me every other word. Sometimes he struggled so pitifully with the words his forehead squeezed into a knot and shoulders hunched over the book that I gave in and finished it for him. But he got better and better at it. He began to tackle books on his own. Now I could bribe him to sweep the room by bringing home books for him from the school library. He learned to sweep quite clean, even Ma would have been satisfied. One evening I was teaching him to wash dishes. Miss Velma was at her post in the gallery with the Daily Word, for Mr. Cephas was out. I was giving instructions to Michael, and Michael was talking without stopping, like a parrot. Now that he was no longer afraid of me, he could not stop chattering. He would talk for hours if I didn't shut him up. Michael was standing on a stool at the sink splashing water, playing with the soap, and talking his head off. Mr. Cephas was suddenly upon us. He gasped and rushed back out towards the gallery. Michael fell silent. He stopped playing in the sink and started to wash dishes in earnest, thinking, perhaps, that his father would be pleased at his helpfulness. Mr. Cephas was ranting in the drawing room and the angry sound was coming closer. Then he was in the kitchen again, with Miss Velma meek and cowering behind him. She was looking as if he had dragged her bodily through the house. Washing wares, Mr. Cephas was shouting at her. In the kitchen, washing wares. I tired talk to you about how you turning this boy into a damn kunumanu. No wonder he can't learn his book. 2 female in the house and my son have to be washing wares. Boy, get your tail down from there. And if your mother put you to wash wares again, tell her to go to hell. And twice his hand flew up as if to hit Miss Velma, and she cringed each time. I was opening my mouth to say to Mr. Cephas that it was not Miss Velma, but Miss Velma shot me a glance which said I should be quiet. She was right. Mr. Cephas knew full well that she had not made Michael wash the dishes. Miss Velma couldn't make Michael do anything. So Mr. Cephas must have known that I was the one who had him over the sink. But throughout his ranting he never once looked in my direction. Later in the evening he called Michael, in a grim voice, to come and read. Although Michael could read much better now, he still balked and stalled when his father ordered him to read, and the school reading book contained so much foolishness that anybody would choke on it. That evening Mr. Cephas beat him with the reading book, his belt, his slipper, and a carved walking stick that was part of the drawing room decorations. Miss Velma stayed hidden. The following afternoon Miss Velma called me into her bedroom. There was a photograph album on the bed, and this she invited me to look through. It began with pictures of herself as a young girl, posing in gardens and on steps with her skirt gaily spread out around her, pictures of her taken in studios, against painted walls of sea, mountain, or flowery meadow. In one photograph she was wearing a school uniform. In all, she was a laughing, lively young person. There was her wedding picture, with Mr. Cephas looking like a fattened penguin in his 3-piece suit, and Miss Velma with life still shining out from her. There were pictures of Michael, an ugly baby, bald and with an old man's face. While I looked through the album, Miss Velma was sorting the clothes that she had just taken off the line. Suddenly she said, "You mustn't go against them, you know. Your father, you mustn't go against him. It don't pay to get them vex. When you get big and you have your husband, you will know for yourself. Jump high or jump low, you have to please them. That is a woman's lot." She took the album and turned back to the picture of herself in school uniform. In the picture she looked about 12 years old. "I was a bright little girl like you know. Bright as a bulb, they used to say. I start to go to secondary school, too. But it wasn't like now. In those days you had to pay school fees. And then they only had secondary schools in the city. So when you add up school fees, bus fare, books, uniform, lunch, well, when my younger brother reached the age for secondary school, they take me out and put him in. They didn't have the money to pay for 2. And it's more important for a boy to get education. They put me by a lady to learn sewing. Then I went to work in a shirt factory. When I meet your father, I was working there. As soon as we get married, he make me leave the job." Miss Velma sighed and her talkative mood vanished. There was still a mountain of clothes on the bed to be sorted out before the hours of ironing began, mostly Michael's and Mr. Cephas's shirts, jerseys, vests, long pants, short pants, underpants, socks, towels, washcloths, handkerchiefs. I made a move to help her, but she waved me away. "No, child. That is my work. You take your book and study your lesson. And study it good." Chapter 19. Here was nobody in our class who did not feel for Anjani. Although I was the only one who really knew her, the others could tell that all was not well with their classmate. They sympathized with Anjani and they liked her because she was so warm and good-natured. The children in the class were always trying to help Anjani, offering to share their textbooks with her, giving her copybook pages when hers ran out, prompting her under their breath when a teacher asked her a question that she could not answer. One day in PE, Anjani felt faint and had to sit down in the middle of the field. Before the teacher could say anything, a whole band of children, led by Marlon Peters and Naushad Ali, was racing desperately towards the home EC room to get a glass of water for her. Now everyone was quietly up in arms against the circus horse for the way that she was treating Anjani. There was no love lost between Mrs. Lopez and any of us, but Anjani had become her special scapegoat. A good half of the class was no better at maths than Anjani. Marlon Peters and Wayne Joseph were utterly hopeless at it and furthermore did not care a damn. But Anjani tried, and worried, and put out every ounce of effort she could squeeze from her tired body. She did her homework in the lunch hour, when she could use my book. In class she did not let anything distract her. She listened intently to every word that fell out of the circus horse's mouth, rubbing her eyes to chase away sleep. Sometimes her head fell forward suddenly onto her chest but immediately shot up again. Then she sat bolt upright, looking around her in confusion. On some days she simply had to put her head down on the desk for a few seconds at a time. But always she would rouse herself and bravely tackle whatever work we were given in class. Yet Circus Horse was always throwing her most sarcastic remarks at Anjani. She referred to her as Miss Jugmohansing, with a sneer in her voice. Some people in the class were hardly ever called upon to answer questions, but Circus Horse never forgot to spring them on Anjani. She asked Anjani questions which she knew full well she couldn't answer, and insulted her when the girl either gave the wrong answer or just stared speechlessly, at a loss. Mrs. Lopez wrote all over Anjani's exercise books with her hurtful red ink pen, "Hopeless, you will never learn. This is disgraceful, you haven't a clue and you never will." And so on. Anjani came to school one Monday and disappeared for the rest of the week. I grew more despondent every day that she didn't turn up, afraid that Anjani had dropped out now for good. Of late she had begun to talk about giving up the struggle. But if Anjani ever had to drop out of school she would slowly shrivel up and die. She was so determined not to end up like her mother. Anjani wanted to pass her exams and get a job and a place to live, and take her mother to live with her. Anjani would cook and clean for the two of them. Her mother would never have to lift a finger again. She would just wear nice clothes, and get fat and healthy, and go to the cinema every weekend to see love movies, Indian and English. I was miserable, and frightened. Every morning I hoped that Anjani would scurry into the classroom in the way that she always did, trying to make herself invisible because she was so late. Anybody would think that the circus horse also missed her sorely, for again and again she inquired after Miss Jugmohansing. On Friday, at the beginning of the maths period, she looked around the classroom for Anjani and remarked, "So Miss Jugmohansing has left us." Then she turned to clean the blackboard, adding not quite under her breath, "That is one less dunce. One less headache for me. Praise God." This was too much for the class. Immediately the grumbling started up. I was so angry that I couldn't talk. Anjani might be sick or dying, for all this woman knew. And if Anjani had, in fact, given up, then this woman had helped to drive her out of school. I made a loud noise with my chair to catch Mrs. Lopez's attention, and then, looking her straight in the eye, I pushed my pan of maths instruments off the desk. A few seconds of silence passed. Then a little mousy girl sitting near me, a girl who was so quiet and unnoticeable that my mother would have named her God Rest the Dead, positioned her pan at the front of her desk and with a wide movement of her whole arm swept it over the edge. Then, all over the classroom, pans crashed to the floor, spilling out compasses, set squares, pencils, rulers. The noise was deafening. Circus Horse had no words for this occasion. "I am going for the principal," was all she said, as she gathered her belongings and shot through the door. We waited for the principal. Doreen Sandiford was the lookout. She stood in the doorway, ready to dart back into her seat at the first glimpse of the principal. The rest of us held a noisy conference to decide what we would tell her. Our books were open before us so that when Doreen gave the signal we would stop talking and start to study with all our might. But the principal never came. As the days went by, we got used to the Circus Horse marching out of the classroom to go for the principal.